Well, hello everybody. Welcome to today's InSport webinar. We've got a super webinar for you this morning. Great panel of guests to explore the investment opportunity in women's sport. It's something that we've been talking about sporadically over the last 12 months, really, if you've been dialing into our webinars on a regular basis. And I'm delighted that we're able to go through all of the intricacies, all of the benefits and potential drawbacks of investment opportunities in sport, with that particular focus on women's sport today. I've got three fabulous guests who I met yesterday where we did our pre-call. We have Izzy Ray, who's a manager at Deloitte Sport Business Group. We've got William Paul, who's a non-executive director at Dorna Sports. And we've got Anna Wooell, a former investment banker turned independent sports industry consultant, and also involved in an organisation called City Pink, who we will discuss, I'm sure, a little bit later on. I'd like to welcome all of our panelists today. As usual, if you've got any questions whatsoever, please drop those in the question and answer box. I will do my utmost to go through those questions and to either feed them into the discussions as they go along, or there'll be an opportunity at the end of the webinar to cover those types of opportunities. Before we start getting involved in the really the juicy questions, if you like, I'm just going to invite each speaker just to give us a quick 30-second synopsis of them and their interests and what really makes them interested in women's sport. And Izzy, if I can come to you first, if just introduce yourself to everybody and explain what it is you're particularly interested in, please.
Sure, no problem. Morning, afternoon, evening, all. So my name's Izzy Ray, manager in Deloitte Sports Business Group. I've been with the group just over 4 years now, and I lead our work in women's sport, with a particular focus on the commercial development of it. As a keen sort of sports person myself, it's sort of always been an area of interest of mine. So yeah, sort of leading that work, keen to increase the commercial potential of women's sport and contribute to its increased media exposure.
Super, thanks, Izzy, and hello, William. Over to you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Morning, everybody. William Paul here, as mentioned before, non-executive director on the board of Dorna Sports. I'm also a retired partner of one of the European private equity firms, Bridgepoint, and I've spent the last 15 plus years investing in sports amongst other industries. And I think it's been quite clear just the rise that sport has had, as a business, as an industry, as a sector over this time, driven by a lot of factors. But I think the last 24 and especially 12 months have seen unprecedented pressure, and I think will lead to unprecedented change in the area of sport. And certainly the last 24 months have seen a huge increase in interest in women's sports in particular, and that's something that I think is incredibly exciting for the future.
Brilliant, thanks, William. And then Anna, if you could just introduce yourself, and I'm really keen just to unpack this the City Pink organisation a little bit, and also the context that wraps around that interest of yours.
Yeah, so hello everyone. I am a retired investment banker, and my area in there was in financial investment opportunities, bringing them to market. So namely emerging markets and bringing IPOs. And it strikes me that there's a similar asset value of women's sport where it's undervalued. People don't really know anything about it, and there's a investment opportunity from what I can see. So it has a similar level of where my expertise in the past has been, especially around the marketing of it, marketing the values correctly to see the value for investors or for viewers of women's sport. 16 years ago, I founded a women's network called City Pink, his professional women's network, and it grew by word of mouth, around 3,000 members. And whilst we began was born of the investment banking era and change in discrimination laws in the UK. So it's a central piece is the lesbians and the profile of lesbians, but also professional women. So like the invisibility piece. It grew very quickly, much larger, and has kept its it's still running events, but instead of business events, the want is very much in the sporting realm. So that's spectating, but also hosting events, traveling to events, etc. So I really challenge the status quo when I'm looking at sport in terms of some of the assumptions that are based around the investment question. That I challenge the assumptions right from the outset. So that's where I come from in terms of looking at women's sport, and where I think there could be some huge potential.
Mm-hmm. So some really interesting themes just come through those little introductions there. And for me, I think there's something here around the kind of commercialization space in sport, the value that you've all discussed there of sport in particular, and then the investment opportunity and the types of things that as former investment bankers or as directors of private equity organizations or brokering ownership takeovers, that whole investment piece, whether it is private equity, whether it is outside investment, whether it is a simple takeover, is really interesting, I think, particularly in the context of women's sport. But before we go to women's sport specifically, I'll just ask each of you, and I'm going to go back round that same order, if that's okay. So Izzy, William and Anna, what is it about sport that you think attracts this interest and this investment?
I think that's me first, isn't it?
Yeah, sorry, Izzy.
That's right. And so yeah, in terms of sport that attracts investment, I think first and foremost is people are really interested in it. So, you know, lots of people are sports fans, so that's clearly sort of going to attract people to want and investors to want to be more involved in it. And then sort of secondly, from an investment perspective, just thinking about sport more widely, so not just women's sport, probably over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen sort of a significant growth in revenues across a number of sports globally. And a lot of that has been sort of driven by the globalization of sport. You know, you see sort of fans of Premier League clubs from all over the world, not just from sort of the cities they come from in England. So I think sort of that's where the potential is, or the potential has been seen from an investment perspective.
Great stuff. And then over to William, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for days about this because there's so much about sport that I think is inherently fascinating, and certainly from an investment perspective. But I think there's one aspect of sport that is almost impossible to replicate elsewhere, and that is the live nature of the event and the unpredictability of the outcome, and the fact that, you know, once a game has been played, or once a race has been held, or once a tournament has been held, actually there's much less value for us as spectators, as fans, unless you're the really, really hardcore, diehard fan that really wants to analyze a game in detail. It's very little value in going to watch it after the event. So you want to have the live experience. And I think as you look at what else is available on television, certainly from a broadcaster's perspective, there's very little that drives the appointment to view 7:45 p.m. on a Tuesday evening or 2 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. There's very little else that drives that appointment to view from a broadcaster's perspective. So sport has a huge attraction from a spectator standpoint, and that in itself then drives enormous value, because the sponsors know who's going to be tuning in at what time, what sort of demographic they are, and therefore they can have a really, really targeted audience in a way it's quite hard to get elsewhere. So that for me is a fundamental tenet of sport that is almost impossible to replicate in anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Anna, without meaning to leave you till last, and the other two guys able to tick off some of those key points, anything from your perspective?
I think the replication piece is important, because you're looking at the emotion aspect of what sport can bring. It can bring a kind of tribal aspect to it, a belonging. It can bring excitement, and whilst the theatre can also bring an excitement of an event, sport seems to be a wider, stronger feeling, and I think that is difficult to replicate. I would say that things are slightly, or appear to me to be slightly, turning. There is that must watch at this time, but the value of short clips and the event, the longevity of an event now, and the duration of value you can get from an event allows you to keep replaying based on what emotion it brought for you. And the positivity of it, unless of course you're the losing side, is just, if you can capture that piece, that's what makes it so exciting. And that's what makes it exciting from a brand perspective, trying to link it.
There's a couple of things that have come through from all three of you, and I always focus on this emotional connection that we have with sport, these kind of highs and lows of emotion that we feel, but also the lack of opportunity for substitute. So as a fan of a particular football team or of a rugby team or an F1 team, you don't change your allegiance, do you? If your club or the people that you support are not doing so well, you'll still follow them. You might not go and do those live experiences if you can't make that particular fixture, but you will still retain that interest. And from a brand loyalty point of view, it's almost impenetrable, isn't it? And I guess that really increases the commercial value to the potential investor, or indeed to the organisation itself. William, I just want to come to you because we've talked briefly today about private equity. Private equity is clearly becoming more interested in the sport market. We've seen some fairly hefty deals with CVC in rugby union. We've seen some failed opportunities actually, but we've seen Silver Lake go into I think the All Blacks, haven't they, and Manchester City, and that of course helps with some of the other sports. So just give us a quick synopsis of what is it about private equity that is really interested in the sport market, and then we'll really start to get under the skin of the women's sport market and the potential that there is there.
Yeah, so I mean, it can probably divide it into two sides, which is one, why does private equity see sport as an interesting space to invest in? And then there's a really interesting piece that we could debate for a long time, which is, and why should sport be interested in private equity investment? And that's probably a bit of a thornier issue, but one we can definitely touch on if you like. But I'll start with the first one, which is why does private equity see sport as an interesting place to invest? And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but there are some really interesting characteristics about it that, as we've said before, are quite unique. And amongst other things, I think sport just has a different level of engagement and, of course, popularity and affinity with the public than many other things do. And that means that actually, from an investment standpoint, sport is a lot less cyclical than many other industries. You find that interest in football pervades, whether there's an economic upturn, downturn, crisis, or frankly, a global pandemic. And the demand from a public perspective and a viewer's perspective to watch live sport endures and pervades. And I think that is always the case, as long as, of course, the spectacle is exciting. People want to watch the sport. And if a sport gets boring and predictable and the outcome is no longer exciting, then you do see ebbs and flows. And, as probably was the case with Formula One famously, when you get, a champion being too clear a winner for too long, too predictable, then interest can fade. But I think the reality is that that's industry as a whole is much less cyclical than others. It's got very long-term growth prospects, certainly growth history. And that's been translated into, very exciting increases in values for broadcast rights that broadcasters are prepared to pay for sport, but they're typically quite long-term contracts as well. So the way I always think about this is if the sporting spectacle is exciting to start with, and you're hosting it in great venues that are world-class venues that are capable of hosting great sport, then you're going to see that translated in very, very high quality broadcast contracts that will last for the long term. And if you've got all of those three factors, you've got great sport, great venues being shown on great channels, you're going to get great sponsors attaching themselves to that as well. So when you add all of that together, you get a very interesting, very predictable, very visible long-term financial growth profile that actually ultimately demonstrates, really interesting investment characteristics. The adjunct to all of that is that people's interest in sport has been increasing over time, and therefore the valuations of sports businesses, franchises, leagues, etc., has also been growing. So that has helped people create a lot of wealth, create a lot of value out of sport over many years. But it's also having a reverse effect, which is it's making it more expensive to get into the more established franchises and so on. And I think that's where women's sport can be really interesting. Picking up on Anna's point about, what relative value, I think women's sport has a really interesting role to play because it's got a lot of the characteristics that we've talked about before. It's a lot lower down in terms of the growth curve. And there's a lot more runway ahead of it. And I think the relative value that you can get out of growth, out of women's sport is going to be much, much more interesting in the future.
Some fascinating observations there. Actually, we've got two half days on the 7th, 8th of June on private equity investment in sport, and you've just given almost a textbook kind of answer against the architecture for that program that we've put together, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. But you mentioned there, or you referred there to one of Izzy's points about the kind of one of Anna's points about the commercialization. Anna, is it from a women's sport perspective? What is it about women's sport, other than the early part of the growth curve that it's now on, that you think is really going to attract investment generally, private equity in particular, over the next few years?
So it's if you look at the brand, women's sport as a brand, the qualities of the brand are progressive, clean. There's a truth value. If you look at Nielsen Sport, they did a survey, and they were looking at women's sport versus men's sport, and 8% of those that took the survey felt that women's sport was being driven by money, whereas 39% felt that men's sport was being driven by money. If you take a look at just the brand value, or what the women's sport actually represents, it represents a cleaner brand to invest in.
Mm-hmm.
There's still that kind of amateurism aspect to it, which actually is really easy for a brand to buy into. If we look at Australia, an Australian women's sport, which, especially from the cricket perspective, is a few years ahead of UK sport, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. When the men's cricket team were involved in the ball tampering, and that was the national side, there was, issues. But then they were investing heavily into the women's sports side in the T20 World Cup in 2020. Post that, when they looked at fan engagement, and they were looking at pride, trust, respect, enjoyment, and bond with the team, for the first quarter and second quarter of 2020, 4 women's teams hit the top 4 spots of sports teams in Australia. Now that's huge for brands, and that hadn't happened previously. It doesn't necessarily need, for example, the Allianz to be, cheating for women's sport to benefit. Saracens cheating for Allianz to reinvest. We don't need, such negative versus positive, but they have offered opportunities. And from that, when brands start to see the values and also the interest levels, that's when things start to move. So selling that is a really important piece of what women's sport actually represents. And when I was doing some research into CMOs and being pitched for sponsorship, and a lot of disrupting brands starting to come into women's sport, what was interesting was Barclays said that they actually approached the WSL. When I asked, for example, Habito, which is a financial disruptor, they're sponsoring Team GB on skateboarding. You know, how many brands? You know, what about women's sport? The CMO has never been approached by a women's sporting brand. So, and she's approached me. She
Wow.
said 4 to 6 times a week she gets some kind of pitch, but never from a women's brand. So it feels like there's within sponsorship there is an easy sell into this at a higher value.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, to bring some of the points that Izzy and William brought together earlier, that undervaluation that you're talking about, almost that move from amateurism through to more bona fide professional codes, more professionalized structures and systems, should all see that undervaluation, that growth curve, as William described it, be accelerated quite quickly. And I'm left thinking, I'm going to bring Izzy in now, if that's okay. And I'm left thinking about the Deloitte's annual review of football finance that, you know, as an academic, I think I've got the back catalogue right the way through to, goodness me, 1995, or might be even before that, whenever it started. They're now appending into that report issues around women's football in particular. But I think it was on Wednesday we had the release of the FIFA benchmarking report, and a huge set of data really focused on women's football. So Izzy, based on what we've just heard there from William and Anna, what do you think the future holds for, I guess, women's sport generally, and perhaps women's football in particular, from your perspective?
Sure. So just to explain the context of that FIFA report. So the reason why FIFA commissioned that work is because for anyone that works in women's sport or women's football will be aware there's a huge lack of data in the industry, and as a result that sort of led or contributed to an underinvestment in women's sport, basically because there wasn't the data there for investors to make informed decisions. So as such they stayed away from the industry. So that was the real purpose of the report. So the data in there, which was collected from 30 elite or top tier women's football leagues and their member clubs, really creates some super interesting insights and sort of useful bits of data which will help investors make those decisions. So for example, one of the key findings was that sponsorship is a big differentiator for women's football clubs and leagues. So for example, sponsorship revenue accounted for around 70% of the total revenue for the higher generating clubs, whereas for the lower generating clubs, it's sort of down to 35% or a lot lower, sort of as the total revenues decrease. So then coming back to that point, sort of which Anna was discussing there around sort of the value of women's sport to brands, and that the value is not just in the eyeballs, so not just in the amount of people that are watching the game, but in sort of creating that affiliation between sort of what women's sport or what the investing in women's football or investing in a particular women's league or club is saying about that brand. I think that's of particular importance to brands, sort of given that sort of the younger generation of people of anyone sort of the public coming through is increasingly sort of interested in the values of the brands that they're purchasing. So for brands being able to signal that, you know, they care about diversity and inclusion, and a prime example of that is through affiliating themselves with a women's club or league or athlete, then, you know, that really puts that brand in a strong position in the minds of those consumers that it's trying to reach.
Mm-hmm. And I guess if we just open that up a little bit now, from a COVID perspective, we've heard a lot about the sport market generally losing quite a lot of value over the last 12 months, the inability of fans to be able to go in and watch major tournaments. There's a huge question mark, I think, at the moment, isn't there, over whether the Olympic Games in Tokyo will actually take place this summer because of the way the pandemic is still taking hold. Do you think that that impact that COVID has had on revenues has increased or reduced the potential valuation of women's sport entities? So what I'm trying to say there is, has COVID actually, as an opportunity, made those sports more investable because they're much lower value or valued much lower because of that restriction of revenue? It's open to anyone to just jump in if you want to say something.
Okay.
Go on, Anna. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just looking at the average spectator that's going to women's sport, and then if you take a top price, I think it's £15 as a top price, and £1,000 is the average. The revenue loss from a match is significant, but it's it doesn't scratch the surface. I do believe COVID has created more of a as Izzy's alluded to, the purpose piece of where you want to put your money, what's important to you, and I think that will play strongly into the hands of women's sport.
Mm-hmm. Sure. William, I think you were going to come in there, yeah?
Yeah, I'll just add into that. I mean, I guess, when you talk about value, I mean, I think about it on two different bases, really. Does COVID change the value of women's sport? When I think of that, I think about what's the potential for women's sport over the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I don't think COVID has changed the potential for women's sport over the next 10 years. So the intrinsic value of it, in my view, is no different today to what it was before. I think there's huge value and huge potential there because the drivers around it and the imbalance that's there that needs to be rectified, I think, remains the same. The difference might be, though, that sports teams, leagues, franchises may need financial assistance more today than they did before, and therefore be prepared to do a deal at a different price point. Mm-hmm. But for me, that doesn't change the intrinsic value of women's sports over the long term. So they're two slightly different things. Not wanting to be opportunistic about the world, because I think the only way really to invest in sport, in my view, is if you have a 10-year view here, because there's lots of work to do. The rewards won't be immediate, but the rewards are definitely there to be had over the long term. So I think that for me would be the right way to think about investing in women's sport, and if anybody was wondering about that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good response, actually. And we hear a lot, don't we, about the importance of that sustainable approach to sport that is going to make sure these organisations, leagues, associations, franchises, whatever it might be, are embedded in cultural communities for the long term. And there are no quick fixes with any of it. As the industry itself, whilst old in terms of its participation, the sport industry as a professional institution is much newer, isn't it? So it's still going through a level of maturity. And as we've discussed broadly today, women's sport is also going to be at a different stage on that continuum. And then depending on the type of women's sport we're talking about, is then going to be on a different point on that continuum again. The last thing I want to talk about is I want to bring us back to that emotional connection, but that live experience that we've heard a little bit about this morning. And the impact of TV and media rights revenue. Because if we look at, it's an easy example, and I apologise to everybody that's listening, because I tend to talk about football because that's what I do a lot of. But if we think about football, we know that in the elite leagues, there's a huge amount of media revenue. But those media revenues, if they're collectively bargained, will focus on the match itself, the 90-minute game, the sale of those rights for people to consume. What we've seen, though, over the last 12 months is a proliferation of content. We've seen more free-to-air activities. We've seen cricket on free-to-air. We saw a great deal done with the BBC and the Women's Super League, where they're going to share some of the rights with Sky to make sure that the game isn't behind a paywall. But I've also looked at some of the sports in the States, particularly the UFC. And the UFC have a very, very different model to European team sports in terms of their bargaining for media rights. And they own all of their rights, and they produce all of the content, and they make money off that content. And to go back to a point William mentioned, they're then selling that content on a daily basis. So it's not just the fight night on a Saturday evening or whatever time it is. They're selling content all the way through the week, and it's a 365-day a year, 24/7 business, which has kind of exponentially grown its value, and is the reason why I think it sold for about $4 billion as a sporting enterprise. So on that basis, do we think that women's sport can learn some lessons around those, either collective bargaining of rights, or can sports produce their own content to make sure that, I think Izzy mentioned, 70% of some teams is made up of sponsorship revenue. Can we equalize that revenue through better media rights value, do you think? And I'll go to Izzy first.
I was just going to say, can I jump in there on that?
Oh, yeah, that's all right then.
I think there's probably a lot to unpack in what you said. But just to take the point around so the value in media rights first, I think it's worth taking a step back and considering what the value chain is. So thinking sort of what drives the value in those media rights. And I think sort of there's a number of different points that will drive value in media rights. But probably the biggest one at the moment is around exposure. So creating that exposure around the sport, leading to a growth in fan base, leading to sort of, once you've got more fans and more eyeballs, you then creating opportunities for or interest from commercial partners, which then creates income in the game, sort of leading to potentially higher wages, leading to sort of positive knock-on effects, so like more professionalism in the sport, resulting in an improved product, getting more fans, more exposure. And it's not until you've been around that value chain a few times that there's probably an opportunity to earn greater revenues from media rights. So I think there's probably a risk or something to be aware of for women's sports, which are trying to grow their fan bases at the moment. And there's that trade-off around media rights revenue versus exposure. So potentially sort of having the sports on free-to-air at the moment to generate that fan base, and then once that fan base has been generated, sort of then considering how can revenues be generated through media rights, and whether that's through their own OTT service, or whether that's through sort of traditional pay TV, or potentially a mixture of both, is something to be considered. But I think in the first instance, it's probably around generating that exposure and fan base, which will then drive those media rights.
Yeah, sounds good. William, and then I'll bring Anna in.
Yeah, I mean, 100% agree with what Izzy said just there. I think that's exactly the way to think about this, that exposure, viewership, popularity has to come first. And how do you build that? And free-to-air is a great platform, a great means of doing that. I think the other thing just to bear in mind, and probably at a slight tangent, is the question of OTT and going direct to consumer. And it's being talked about a lot in a lot of different contexts as, the next panacea. Is this, technology is going to allow every individual sport to go and compete with all of the major broadcasters. And I just note one word of caution on that respect, because yes, technology can be an incredibly helpful tool, but at the end of the day, that popularity and that visibility that Izzy was talking about really comes from marketing spend. And so to build your popularity, you do need to market it. And however you're going to do that, having a broadcast partner on board that may not be spending a lot on the media rights, but that is spending on marketing and awareness and visibility of your sport, has huge value in it as well. So I think that's just worth bearing in mind, that having that sort of hybrid model that you just referred to in WSL, for example, but attached to some really, really good marketing initiatives around that, that's exactly the right formula to really build awareness and visibility in advance of then starting to capitalize the value of that popularity through increased value of media rights in the future.
There's a really nice live example of that, actually, isn't there, with the Women's Super League netball and the Vitality arrangement with Sky. And I think the rights were essentially zero for that, but the marketing spend and the profile raising activity that they set up with the Sport England Back to Netball campaign was really significant. And we're now seeing, well, hordes of women going back to playing netball in local leagues, but also an increase in popularity at grassroots. So, as the father of a 10-year-old girl that watches England netball and is absolutely fascinated by it, and a mum who plays netball herself, she can't get enough of it. And the fact that we're turning the television over to watch Super League netball is a very different viewing experience to what it was a couple of years ago, when all my son wanted to do was watch Manchester United play on the television, despite their lack of sporting success. Anna, I'm just going to bring you in for a bit of a last word before I summarise. So, anything else you want to add on the kind of sponsorship, commercialisation, media rights piece?
I think the lobbying is sorry, not lobbying. The marketing piece is absolutely critical. In that FIFA report, I think we got some data that it was is this right? 5% is spent on of budget is spent on marketing. That given that data and knowledge and just, I don't know how long it took you to work out how to watch the netball, but I like lots of women's sports. It's very difficult, especially probably my age, to work out how you access these things. Does 50,000 downloads on the FA player? It's great. It's a great asset. But do many people know about it? I'm not sure. So I'm with William in terms of marketing and pushing the budget that way, and the production that you alluded to yourself is absolutely key, because when something looks world class, it makes you feel world class, and makes you want to be part of the event. So absolutely pushing it that way, lobbying government to get more of women's sports events on free to air and must haves. That is woeful, the list currently. So I would definitely put in there. But for me, it's all about it's a new sport, essentially. It's a new asset. You can set yourself up differently. I would be pushing heavily through marketing and pushing heavily through data collection, and that's a lot of spend on that one for a longevity, because there is a sustainability aspect in women's sport that we've been here before. We've been to the women's sports, it's on its rise. We've seen it all before. There's newspaper articles across decades when this has happened, but the sustainability level has to come from a push that way.
Yeah, Claire's just made a really good point, actually, in the comments about the kind of nature and opportunity that exists around women's sport, because of the difference it has with the men's game or men's codes, because the service, the type of product is slightly different. The access to the sports stars, the athletes, the women playing these various sports is so much better, and it creates a much more robust atmosphere, I think, for marketing and for sponsors and commercial partners to sell into its space. We do have one question in the Ask a Question box from Dan that I'm going to come to, because he's asked it on the comments box and in the Ask a Question, so I will come to it. Before I do, for the person, you'll have heard me say we've got a private equity in sport course planned with InSport. We've got a great range of speakers attached to that. We've been through some of the key things today, and we're going to unpack a lot of those issues through that private equity course. There's a big green button at the bottom of the screen where you can check out that private equity in sport course. And I'm reliably informed by head office that that anybody that's registered for the webinar is entitled to a discount on that program. So if you're interested in it and want to learn a little bit more, hit that green button and find out a little bit about that. Talking of buttons, just to come back to Anna's point, I remember trying to watch Gloucester Rugby the other week on BT Sport, and apparently it was on BT Sport 2 and on the red button, and by the time I'd found it, Gloucester were about 30 points down, so I didn't watch it for very long. Right, I'm just going to go to Dan's question then. This will be the last one before we do wrap up. I think we've touched on some of this, but do you think there are any fundamental differences in value drivers between men's and women's sport? I might have covered some of them just then, actually. Or is it simply that women's sport is at an earlier stage of development and therefore presents an attractive investment opportunity? I'll go back to the order we started at, if that's okay. So I'm going to go to Izzy first, then to William, and I'm going to give the last word to Anna.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think there's probably fundamentals that are similar, and then also fundamentals that are different. So touching on ones that are similar, for example, creating that emotional connection between fans and the sport is the same across women's and men's sport. But then also women's sport's probably got key differences or unique selling points that men's sport doesn't necessarily have as much. So, for example, sort of what investing in women's sport, means for the brand in terms of what they stand for and the message they're giving off to their consumers. But I also do think that the point in the development cycle where women's sport is a key reason why it's an attractive investment opportunity. It's a lower price point, but it's which is attractive, and it's an industry which has got a strong trajectory. So it's probably textbook investment. Buy when something's cheap, strong growth trajectory, and sell when it's increased in value. So yeah, probably haven't sort of agreed or disagreed with the question, but it's presented both sides of the argument.
Brilliant, thanks, Izzy. And then William, you've been involved in a few of these deals before. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super question because again, it's one you could debate for a whole day. But I'm very much in line with Izzy as well, which is, at the end of the day, it's sport, and the fundamental drivers of how to create value in sport and why is sport of interest from an investment standpoint are absolutely there. I do believe that sort of now is the time for women's sport as well in a different way. It's a bit more difficult to say now is the time in men's sport more generally, especially as you're thinking about rights values perhaps topping out in English Premier League, for example, things like that. So it's a very different point in the cycle, not just earlier in the curve. I think it's a very different point in the cycle for it. But I think there is one major point of difference, which is back to a point we've already made, both Izzy and Anna have made, which is around the nature of sponsors that you can attract to women's sport. That previously sponsors were attracted to sport because of the individual values of that sport. I think women's sport more broadly taps into a really important topic of diversity and inclusion, which is ever more important from a corporate agenda, and therefore the corporate interest in getting involved in it is fundamentally different, I think, to a traditional going out for a men's football club sponsor or for a Formula One racing team sponsor. I think the dynamics and the drivers that you can offer to the sponsors are different, and therefore I think the opportunity can long term be greater as well. So that would be the major point of difference that I would highlight. It will be is encapsulated in a topic of much familiarity behind the fundamental drivers of what makes sport interesting.
Yeah, brilliant. And then Anna, any last words from you on that question?
Yeah, just to go on William's point about inclusion, diversity. The cricket for me is a real surprise. Cricket is like empire building white, and the work that they're doing in terms of their equal pays, the contracts, the marketing of the 100, everything that they've set up and the teams that they've set up in the 100 in terms of longevity and sustainability. Cricket, having been very near the bottom for me, is, if I had to rank them on who's setting themselves up for the future, it would be there, and it would be cricket. I think football has got a long way to go in that respect. To Dan's question, for me, it's a question of risk. What's your risk if you're investing in men's sport and you're investing in women's sport? For men's sport, it's being crowded. It's a crowded space. Are you going to get the cut through? Have you overspent? I mean, the prices on the broadcasting rights are very high. On the women's side, you're not putting as much capital in, as less capital at risk, and the growth has to be higher than men's sport. There's growth in both, but you're putting less at risk for a higher growth. And that in the context of where you could put money, not just in sport, where you could invest, and the growth potential versus the valuations suggests on a risk basis, women's sport does look particularly attractive now, as some of them are actually coming out of the first stage of the product cycle.
Wow. Do you know, I think I said to you all in the green room, I often learn more while I do these webinars than I do from reading the academic stuff that I do and the work that I get involved in. Folks, it's been a superb session. I have so many more questions. We haven't even got near something that I think it's Cherry's put into the chat box around the differentiation between individual sports and team sports and what we can learn, the investment portfolios we might look for. Anna, you've just raised a bunch more questions for me around the kind of risk management profile, the diversification strategy that organizations and investment organizations might look for. But we're going to have to leave it there. We've overrun on the time that I promised you we'd be on here for today. What I'm going to try to do, shamefully, is in our private equity course in a couple of weeks' time. I'm going to try and feed some of these questions in so I can get some more insight and see how these go. Listen, everybody, on behalf of myself and the team at InSport and all of the audience, I'd like to thank you so much for your time today. Anna, Izzy, William, you've been terrific guests. I've learned a load, and I hope everybody else has too. In the usual InSport style on Crowdcast, when I end this broadcast, everybody will just be chucked out of the system. It's nothing personal, and very, very many thanks from me and the rest of the team. Thanks, everybody. Take care. We'll see you again soon.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.